For over a century, Canada and the United States have shared the waters of the St. Mary and Milk Rivers through negotiated agreements. The International St. Mary and Milk Rivers Study is a 4-year effort to determine if improvements can be made. The study will present its report to the International Joint Commission in June of 2025. Now, to chat about the study in more detail and how it will impact residents on both sides of the border is Al Pietroniro. He's a professor at the Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary. Al, welcome to Bridge City News.
Well, thanks for having me, Al. I really appreciate you taking the time to learn about the study.
Oh, you bet, Al. Now, first of all, what is the focus and objective of this Milk River study?
So a lot of folks aren't really familiar with the actual basin itself, right? So for over 100 years now, there's been a diversion of water from the St. Mary system, and the St. Mary flows into the Saskatchewan River, right? And the Milk River actually starts in the US, comes up into Canada, goes back into the US, and the Milk River actually flows into the Missouri system, so it ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so in about 1909, a diversion was built to take a higher yielding river, which is the St. Mary River, and move some water into the Milk River to allow for irrigation downstream on the US. And so there was a treaty established. It was actually the first treaty ever established between the US and Canada on water to make sure that there was basically a fair sharing of water between both countries. And so there's rules and regulations about how much water can be diverted, how we account for that water. And over the years, what we've noticed in trying to manage the system is that both countries have not maximized the beneficial use of those waters because of timing and climate issues and just changes in the basin. And so the officers in charge of that treaty decided that it was maybe a good idea to have a study to see what has changed in the basin and if we can make better use of the water on both sides of the border.
Let's talk about the connection now between St. Mary and Milk Rivers and why the St. Mary Canal is so important for water supply during the hot and dry summer months.
So if you know the area at all, you'll know that the St. Mary River actually starts in the headwaters of the Saskatchewan Basin, around Glacier National Park on the US side, right? And so it's a high yielding basin. It has a lot of water, high mountains, lots of snowpack, right? If you look at the Milk River, it's kind of a foothills type of river, and so it's quite a bit drier and doesn't yield nearly as much water, right? So it's more rainfall dependent than snow dependent, right? And so the volumes of water that go through that system are a lot less. And so if you're irrigating in Montana on the Milk River, sort of downstream of the Canadian border, there's just not enough water supply to support that irrigation, right? And so that's why the structures were built.
So when did the original water sharing agreement between Canada and the US for the St. Mary and Milk Rivers originate?
So it's an interesting story because it started in around 1909. I think around sort of the 1890s, 1900s, engineers in the US were looking at that particular diversion. It's a really interesting diversion in the sense that it's all gravity fed. So there's no pumps. It's all gravity that takes the water from one watershed to another, which is pretty unique. But so around 1909, as this canal system was being built, it's about 26 miles of canal. The Canadian farmers on the Canadian side of the border weren't too happy that water was being taken out of the Saskatchewan Basin, and so they started building what they called the Spite Ditch. And the Spite Ditch is actually near the town of Milk River, and it was a ditch that was going to take the water in the Milk River as it was coming back into Canada and put it back into the Saskatchewan system. And so that caused a dispute between both countries. And so then it was decided that, cooler heads should prevail here, right? And we should share the waters. And so that's when the treaty started. So 1909 was the beginning of the treaty. And in 1921 was when the orders were set out. So how much Canada gets versus how much the US gets, and sort of how the whole basin was going to be treated.
So Al, how has this agreement impacted the water access for both nations?
So, I think in general, it's been beneficial. Back in those days was really focused on irrigation and expansion of the West, as you well know. And so what it allowed for was actually expansion and irrigation on the US side of the border, because there's water that gets stored in the Fresno Reservoir that comes through the system. But it also allowed for water supply on the Canadian side of the border as well, right, for the Milk River irrigators. So I think both countries benefited from the use. And oftentimes, if you look at the Milk River, let's say in July, probably 80–90% of the water flowing through the Milk River is actually U.S. water.
So Al, what factors in the watershed have really changed over time?
So a couple of things to think about in the basin itself. So one is, it's Glacier National Park on the U.S. side of the border, right? And so the glaciers have receded, and so we've seen that impact in the water supply for sure. But we've also noted over the years that the weather patterns have changed, right? This year's it's been particularly dry in some parts of the country, as you know, right? In some parts of the U.S., the June rains that we typically saw and expected don't happen as often and as kind of regularly as they used to happen, right? And so the actual climate of the system has changed a fair bit, right? And so that's a big part of why we're looking at this study. The other thing is the infrastructure has changed a little bit too, right? So the conveyance capacity of the canal isn't what it used to be, right? Things tend to erode over time, right? And so there's a lot of infrastructure that's kind of being looked at now, and so we're hoping that over time, the conveyance capacity, so how much water the system can actually push through, will increase over time to its kind of original design levels, and so we want to look at the impact of all those things. The last thing I'll say is, the way the treaty is organized is we actually allow for certain things to happen with respect to water sharing between both countries. And those are elements that, perhaps we should revisit, right? So we're looking at that as well. So we don't change the treaty per se. We just look at how we implement the treaty a little differently. And so we're looking at aspects there as well.
How much of a voice do Indigenous groups have in regards to this study and in regards to the water supply from both rivers?
Yeah, so part of the study, an important part of the study is, and actually initiated through the IJC, has been to have an Indigenous advisory group as part of this effort, right? And so we are listening to Indigenous voices on both sides of the border. And so we've had regular conversations with them. They're actually sitting on some of the science committees as well. So some of the work we're doing, the technical work we're doing, we've asked some of the Indigenous water managers to help us, understand the system. And so we really want to bring an Indigenous perspective to the study as well, right? That's important. Times have changed and we need to keep up with that.
Let's talk about some of the other specialist groups as well involved in this study of St. Mary and Milk Rivers.
So the way those studies set up is and these studies are actually have been run across the country, right? There was a Souris River study done a few years back. There was one on the Great Lakes. There's one on the Richelieu River in Quebec as well, Lake Champlain. And they're all sort of set up to have a strong technical element. So we have a technical working group that's been developed. We look at different options, right? So we're looking at both structural and non-structural options to see, how we can improve the entitlements of water on both sides of the border. And so the technical working group are typically made of people who actually work in the basin, right? So whether it's Alberta Environment and Protected Areas, people that work on managing water in Alberta, or whether it's the Montana authorities or the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, we bring all those experts together to set up an extra expert panel on all kinds of aspects, right? Socioeconomic, technical, structural, non-structural, other things. But next to that, we actually have a couple of advisory groups. I mentioned the Indigenous advisory group, but we also have a public advisory group. So we seek input from the public. We've had a number of town halls. We had one in Milk River. We had one in Havre. We're going to keep doing that over the course of the study. And we want public input to make sure that whatever we recommend to governments at the end of the day, right, the public has a buy-in into how we're doing that, right? So there's a public advisory group as well. And then to make sure that the science we're doing and the engineering we're doing is state of the art, we have an independent review group that reviews everything we do on the technical side. And lastly, this is all managed by a study board, right? And so I'm the Canadian co-chair, there's a US co-chair, and then we have 3 members for each country that make sure that everything's happening.
Let's talk a bit about the water table level, because I've noticed with a lot of reservoirs in the province here, they're drying up with the drought that we've had, a lot of the hot and dry weather. Is that weather also impacting some of the rivers?
Yeah, for sure, right? So we had a really early runoff this year, as you well know, right? And so waters have peaked. The Milk River is interesting right now because actually the Fresno Reservoir is actually doing quite well. There was a lot of rain in that specific part of the US, right? And these are why these things are difficult, right? So the Fresno Reservoir is actually reasonably full right now. And so I think, you know, the basin's actually doing reasonably well this year because of that. Although there are certainly, it's really quite dry on the Canadian side of the border, right? And so the thing about this basin is there's not a lot of infrastructure. There's the diversion infrastructure, right? But there's not a lot of storage. And so, you know, that's something we're going to look into with the study. But yeah, the only main storages really are on the U.S. side of the border, and they're managed by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation on the Milk River. Of course, the St. Mary system is quite different, right? Once you get up towards Lethbridge, then you have the St. Mary Reservoir, which is a big storage facility, right, for irrigation for Alberta. But that's really kind of outside the limits of the study.
That's also drying up, I got to tell you.
Yes.
It is drying up right now. We've had quite a bit of dry and hot weather here. Al, let's talk specifically about the advisory groups participating in the study, and what role do they play in providing input and feedback on the work of the technical working groups?
So part of what we're trying to do or what we will do is really develop what we call indicators, right? And so we want to look at socioeconomic indicators. So, you know, look at if when water is available, people make the best use of it, right? You know, how that's going to work. And so we need to talk to local farmers and irrigators to make sure that we're understanding, you know, their perspectives in terms of the water allocations, right? And that's on both sides of the border, right? But there's also other groups, you know, there's recreational users as well, right? Like I said earlier, there's the Indigenous groups as well, right? And so we want to make sure that all those perspectives are there. You know, there's towns along the border, right? And that we have to respect that they have water supply and all those things. So really it's to get all that input to make sure that we understand what's important to the individuals who live in the basin, right? So that we can reflect that in looking at the various options we're gonna table. And make sure that you know, we minimize the impacts to people, or we you know, increase the net benefit to folks as well, right? And so that's really why we need the public input, right? They're the ones that are affected by this, and so they need to have a major say.
Are there any findings from this study specifically that surprised you?
Well, you know, we're just getting started in a sense that the technical work's going on right now. I think we kind of know what to expect because we've been dealing with this basin a long time, right? And so we kind of know what to expect. But you know, we'll see down the road when we make the recommendations if there's anything that is surprising to us, right? There always are issues that sort of crop up that perhaps we hadn't thought of, right? And so that's why it's really important to get the public and Indigenous engagement there. And so, you know, we'll see what materializes. We're open to all the discussions that are coming down the road here, and you know, we want to do the best for the citizens in the region, right? So right now we think we kind of know where things are going to land, right? But we don't want to bias any decisions here, right? We want to be open to all considerations.
So bottom line, how will this study really benefit Albertans and other Canadians?
Well, I think in the Milk River Basin and on the St. Mary systems, right, it'll allow to ensure that the entitlements that Canada receives, right, are sort of for the most beneficial use, right? And so right now, in some years, right, Canada doesn't necessarily, especially on the milk system, isn't able to use all of its entitlements, right? Because the thing about water is sometimes it often comes at the wrong time of the year. And so how do you deal with that, right? So you need water to irrigate, let's say in July and August, right? Most of the water comes in May and June. You know, how should we fix that, right? And that's kind of where we're focused on. So in the end, I think it'll be a benefit to both the US and Canada.
So if viewers want to know more about this study, Al, where can they go? So
if they just do a Google on St. Mary Milk Study, it'll lead them to the IJC site, and they can go straight there. And all the information is there, including the recent released sort of science plan that we have. And so people are encouraged to look at that and get back to us if they have any questions. There's an email that they can send emails to, and we'll do our best to answer any questions.
Al Pietroniro is a professor at the Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for your interest. Take care.